and welcome back to The Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we chronicle transcendent truth by traveling further up and further into the classic works of children's literature.
This is Season 9, Episode 14, The Flood, which covers chapters 31 and 32 of The Princess and the Goblin.
Here we are, the end of the book, The Princess and the Goblin.
One last ride.
You must be a little sad because we have been sitting here talking for about an hour or so before you've been really putting off recording this episode, I feel like.
Right. It feels like it's coming to an end here.
You just were a little sad about it all.
Even though we have quite a few things queued up.
Yes, not just for this episode. We just mentioned in the last episode that we are already looking ahead to The Hobbit this fall, which we're really excited about. Going to be our longest season ever, too, because there's so many chapters in that book.
So many chapters.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting to think about how we go about that, but that's not what we're talking about today. We are talking about the flood here at the end of The Princess and the Goblin. You and I both mentioned in the last episode that really chapter 30, The King and the Kiss, could have been the end of the book, but it wasn't.
Right. We have a denouement with subterranean waters.
Yeah, I'd like to actually go ahead and just jump right in because there's quite a bit to cover here in just these two relatively short chapters.
Yeah.
Well, here is our summary for the final two chapters of the book. Irene, Curdie, the king, and all of his courtiers are celebrating the safe return of the princess in the castle. The feast is brought to an abrupt end when noises warn the revelers of a coming flood. Curdie is able to tell the king of the goblin's second plan, allowing everyone to escape. The inhabitants of the castle make their way to higher ground outside just as the castle overflows with water. Surprisingly, many goblins are among the flotsam and jetsam. Their own civilization has been wiped out by their poor planning. With the goblin threat minimized, the king and Irene leave Curdie to watch over the repairs of the castle.
Flotsam and jetsam.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
The Lord of the Rings. I know it's actually exists outside of that, but to me, it's a chapter in, I think, The Two Towers. Mm-hmm. And so, to me, I know that actually is a phrase outside of Lord of the Rings, but it's only a Lord of the Rings phrase to me.
Yeah. I think that would be a good name if you had a pair of animals, maybe two dogs.
Flotsam and yeah. Wasn't that the name of the eels in The Little Mermaid? Believe it or not.
I think you're right.
Yeah, the name of the Disney version, not the Hans Christian Andersen version. Yeah. He didn't name them that. But I think that's the name of the eels in the movie. I don't know why I know that.
I don't either.
I'm not a fan of that movie.
Yeah.
Okay, so I guess that's all we got.
Speaking of stuff that's underwater.
Yeah, no, there we go. Yeah, speaking of stuff that's underwater, let's talk about the goblins here. So we're having a feast, and there's this noise of a thunder, and our heroes here believe maybe it's another thunderstorm. We did just have that really big flood, right? Or not really big storm, excuse me. But that's not what it is. Curdie goes really quickly. He warns the king, and really, this chapter is all about Curdie as a hero. And before we talk about how exactly we get all of these people to escape, I wanted to ask you about Curdie's role in all of this, because just a few chapters ago, remember that Curdie said because he didn't believe in the grandma, he believed in her right when she was in front of him, but he couldn't see her, that he wasn't allowed to save Curdie. Remember just last episode, they're inside.
He wasn't allowed to save Irene.
He wasn't allowed to save Irene. I said Curdie. Yeah, sorry. He said to Irene, no, I didn't save you. I wasn't allowed to because I didn't believe. But yet here, he is allowed to. What? And I don't have an actual answer. I'm not fishing for anything. Why do you think Curdie is not allowed to then, but is allowed to save everyone here?
Maybe it's a shot at redemption. Maybe he's learned, and that's why he's able to do this. And part of the reason that he's able to give advice to the king and have it instantly followed is because he's built up trust with the people he's around. But also, this is the project that he's been working on more. He knows more about.
He's a minor, yeah. That's probably
he's been investigating this whole time, and it finally all clicks and comes together for him.
But, the king does just turn him. It's so interesting. When Curdie says to the king that hey, Your Majesty, I think I know what it is. I have no time to explain. Tell everyone to get on the mountain. This is what MacDonald writes. He says, the king, who was the wisest man in the kingdom, knew well there was a time when things must be done and questions left till afterward. He had faith in Curdie and rose instantly with Irene in his arms. And then he goes on to say, every man and woman follow me. He strides out into the darkness. So, I mean, he follows him immediately here. And really, Curdie is a prince in everything but name in these two chapters. There's so much imagery.
Because he acts like a prince.
He acts like a prince. So much of MacDonald's kind of, this theme, this thesis of the book in many ways comes to life here when Curdie is treated by the actual royalty as if he's royalty himself. I don't want to get too far ahead of us, but there's even the very kind of prescient imagery of him getting on the white horse at the end. And I think very much of like a white horse is a very royal type of horse. And he's even offered to go off with the king and Irene at the very end. And so all of these things are really making Curdie into this prince in the kingdom, despite the fact that he isn't. And he goes back to live in the little shack with his parents.
Yeah. He turns down a job offer.
Exactly.
Because he wants to hang out with his parents more, which, I mean, he is pretty young.
Yeah, he's like 13. So I don't know. Back then,
He's got a couple years, I guess.
You think he was just looking forward to hanging out with Ludi. Ludi goes back with him. Poor Ludi. We'll talk about her, too, that she still sees the light, and she still doesn't know what it is.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. We'll get to that, though. We're gonna get there. But yeah, I just think I think it's interesting that Curdie is able to save the day here. I wonder if it's one of those kind of Prince Caspian kind of things. Remember when Aslan says to Prince Caspian, "It's because you say you're not ready that I know you are ready." Is it kind of in a way Curdie saying, "I can't save you because I didn't believe." That's like, "Oh, good, you learned the lesson, therefore you are going to be able to have a role to play."
Yeah.
Well, what happens next after Curdie and the king tell everybody it's time to go?
They get out of there, they get up to high ground, and not a moment too soon, because the water comes rushing in and wipes everything out.
Yes, here's what's written. Before he had reached the gate, the noise had grown to a great thundering roar, and the ground trembled beneath their feet. And before the last of them had crossed the court, out after them from the great hall came a huge rush of turbid water and almost swept them away. But they got safe out of the gate and up the mountain while the torrent went roaring down the road into the valley beneath.
That must be a sight to behold.
Really something here. And in fact, I know we're kind of jumping around right now. We're told at the end of this particular chapter, chapter 31, that I think days go by and they're like, all right, we got to go do something about this water, which is pretty crazy, right? Like you think, oh, it's just maybe an hour or so, but they actually have to go back and figure out how to actually put this water out. But let's talk about where this water is coming from, because the king does turn to Curdie and say, hey, what the heck is going on here?
Yeah, and how did you know this is going to happen? So from what I understand, and it is well explained, but it takes a little bit of effort to go through step by step what happened.
Well, yeah, I mean, because each of, what we would consider to be a paragraph, MacDonald thinks is a relatively moderate length sentence. So there's quite a bit to sort through with the prose here.
So this originally was their backup plan. They were going to
This was the backup plan.
The mine. They thought that the mine was worth a lot to the miners, I guess.
It's unclear. Yeah, they seem to remember. There's that line earlier in the book where, because to the goblins mining is so important, they don't really realize kind of the class difference between. Oh no, like the miners are not the input. Sorry to our listeners that are the miners, but it's like the miners are not very high in that class structure that exists in this kind of feudal kingdom here.
Right. I had someone who was doing work at our house tell me that he was going to move out west to be an underground miner.
Yeah.
And I said, why is that? And he says, because of the pay. I said, do you mind if I ask how much? And he said it, and I thought, that is more than that's more than I make with computers.
You sit on in a chair every day.
Right. It's like,
mine's a little bit more dangerous than that.
Right.
You ever been in a mine?
I could get seasonal affective disorder.
There you go.
Diabetes from sitting.
Yeah.
For so long.
This is that episode. Remember the episode of The Office? Is
that
what you're thinking of, right? The safety training, episode 19 of season 3.
This is why I take a break every 5 minutes.
No, I think it's actually episode 18. I might be wrong there. Oh, it's so embarrassing.
Oh, that is embarrassing. What's really embarrassing is when we fact check you saying this. I'm hoping someone has for the last one you did.
I was right. I know that The Convict is episode 9 of season 3, which we
3.
talked about. Hit Training is episode 20. Not both wrong. Both wrong.
Hey,
It's tricky.
I think now that you've admitted that you were wrong, you're gonna get the next one right.
Season 3 is tricky because there's a couple of those like extra long episodes. And it's how do you count those? Like Benihana Christmas, which is the 10th episode, is a double episode. Does that get counted as 10 and 11 or just 10? It's because in syndication they count it differently because it has to be 30 minutes long, as opposed to when it originally aired, and they could do a full hour of a.
Do you think we'll ever be syndicated?
We could be. We've got enough episodes.
We do.
Do any shows get syndicated anymore?
That's my other thing I'm curious about. I watched Sicario, and Jeffrey Donovan from Burn Notice is in there, and I click on his name, and he was in 111 episodes, and you had to have 100 to be syndicated.
Traditionally, that's how television worked. Which is about 5 seasons.
Right, but television has changed so much. I'm not sure it matters yet anymore.
I'm just trying to think. I mean, we actually have Hulu Live TV. So I guess, we have cable, but we only watch sports. So, like, I don't actually know what is on, like, what comes on USA. Like, are they got to be syndicating something, right? TNT, like TBS. But what is it they're syndicating? I don't know.
Things as big as cable channels and these TV conglomerates, they don't just die and disappear. They slowly get smaller if the business is trending that direction. But also places are getting bought up, and there are weird things like a cable company owning, is it Comcast? Comcast owns a network, I think. There's some like NBC, Comcast. There are all these weird things that are happening. So all the rules are getting thrown out.
I think so, because doesn't Comcast and NBC, isn't their logo really similar?
I think
one of them must own the other.
Because 30 Rock did a parody of Cabletown buying the network.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And I think it was in reaction to
But like, what if I were to go to TBS? Remember TBS?
I do.
Like growing up, when I was, in middle school, if you turn it on at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, it was probably Seinfeld, which was, I guess, 10, 15 years old at that point. If I turn on
Seinfeld
TBS,
was 89 to 90.
So yeah, if I'm watching this in 2005, so I'm watching. Okay, so maybe only 5. Maybe only 10 years. But or maybe they're like Friends or something, right?
Yeah.
What if I turn on TBS tonight? It was too late now, but like at 7 o'clock, what are they showing? what is being syndicated on for them?
Yeah.
Are they still showing Seinfeld 30 years later? Is there something else on?
So I will say there's an entire group of people that's not us that wants to hit a button and have something come on, and they don't want it to have a choice.
They're the people who kept Blue Bloods alive for 18 seasons on CBS. I just saw some article in the Atlantic where they were talking about this show that'd been on. I have never heard of this show, and it's been on as long as Grey's Anatomy or something like that. It was just I'm like, that's just I just don't speak to this population of people, I guess, which just
I think that's what's so interesting is that
they do. They're my grandparents.
A show like the one you and I have right here can be. People can find it. People have typed in Narnia on the podcast app and found this show. Mm-hmm. That's amazing. But there's also everything is so split that you can have an entire thing just about Narnia. It can be this really niche thing. But then there's also an entire group of people that doesn't necessarily know how to download a podcast or doesn't really care or want to.
So while you were talking, we needed to end this kind of sidebar we've been having, but I wanted to make sure I ended it correctly by pointing out that Safety Training is technically it was the 19th episode aired of season 3.
That's why you got confused.
So I was correct. Isn't that what I said the first time was 19? Then I got worried. It's because Benihana Christmas now is considered the 10th and 11th episodes of season 3, which pushes Safety Training back to 20 as opposed to when it originally aired as the 19th episode of the season. Yes. I'll take it.
I also think that you have a real skill.
I didn't edit the Wikipedia page, I promise.
Yeah. Everybody check when this comes out. I love that you pointed out that I had a sidebar and that I needed to wrap up, but you got one last word in there.
No, I was the one that took us here. I know I'm not. You did make the comment about Safety Training. You did get us started there about working in a mine. But let's talk about mines. Have you ever been in a mine before?
No, I think I've been in a cave, but I don't think anyone was chiseling anything off. Oh, I did pan for gold on a family trip one time.
Where was this at?
in Boone.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
It's
kind of the, they set up a pile of dirt that they've hidden stuff in, and then you move the pan back and forth in the water and see if there's any gold.
I've looked into a mine before. I don't know how much that really counts, but it was pretty cool. I was in South Pass City, Wyoming.
Oh, okay.
So, I got family out west, and so it's a really famous ghost town there. And I remember this is at least 20 years ago. But that you were allowed to look into a mine, and for all I knew, that just was a fake mine. They just told us that. But you got to look into it. And I just remember thinking it does go back really far. Obviously, I know how mines work, but just looking into a hole in the ground that you cannot see past was. I think you could maybe walk in, maybe 10 or 15 feet, but you couldn't walk past that.
Yeah.
Because again, it was a ghost town. No one was actually mining there.
It sounds like a John Green novel.
Who's that guy? That name sounds familiar.
He wrote Paper Towns.
Oh, and the one with the two kids that are sick and stuff.
There's some stars and someone's faults there.
Yeah, that's The Fault in Our Stars. Okay, yeah. Not
So
interested in his books.
I thought for a moment, have I been in a mine? But I think that was Remember the Titans, when the dad's like, you got to come work in the mines. And then I also think that was October Sky, but that might have just been the same guy playing the dad.
All right, well, let's travel back now to the land of Irene and Curdy.
I just want to say that was a 45-minute tangent, and if you edit any of this, and I find out when I listen to the episode on Wednesday.
That's good. So Curdy and company, really the king and company, are all up on top of the mountain, and the water is coming through, and they realize, wow, this has failed. As you mentioned, it's a little confusing, but the goblins did not, kind of as they planned for their water to overflow the humans' mines.
They thought that the miners were more important.
They thought that the miners were more important, but they,
like you said, because their mining is what they do. They assume that this is a upper echelon job. But the exact line is fancying the miners of more importance to the upper world than they were. That's a bit harsh. But it also, I'm curious what the whole economy looks like in this place, because it really seems like there is the royalty, the staff, and then the miners. But there has to be other things going on. There are farmers too, right?
Well, yeah, I think that, again, it isn't really acknowledged until the final chapter here, but this is the king's summer home. So I am under the assumption that we're in a more remote part of the kingdom. This is kind of his nice, fancy, chateau off in the mountains, where there really is kind of a bare bones staff, and there is, you got the miners out. This is a much more rural place, which makes it interesting. And again, I don't want to get too far ahead of us. I'm getting so excited about the end of this book. It makes me curious about what happens after this book, because again, was Irene sent to this place just because her mother died? How did her mother die? Is something going back on? Is something going on back home? The king keeps leaving. He's not really vacationing here. He's mostly just coming to see Irene, but then he goes back to presumably his, the actual real kingdom. All of those things are not necessarily answered here in this particular book.
And have you read the second one?
I have not.
Okay, me either.
It's on my list. I'll probably read it soon.
What's odd is my son, who is not even 11 months old, has heard the whole thing.
All of Princess and Curdy?
Yeah.
Has he also done The Princess and the Goblin?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. SJ started with that.
Oh,
and then she read him the second one, too.
Because you have both of those nice versions, right?
I do. Yeah.
Nice. I love that. Wait, did I get you that? No, your dad got you that.
Yeah.
I got you the one you already owned.
Yep.
Yeah, nice. Okay. So the other thing that MacDonald mentions is that, they think that the miners are more important, but he says that the readiest outlet the water could find, the water the goblins had kind of let loose down underneath the earth, was the one that it actually turned out to be the tunnel they had made to the king's house, the possibility of which catastrophe had not occurred to the mind of the young miner until he placed his ear close to the floor of the hall. That's Curdy that MacDonald is referring to there, saying that the fastest way out was actually, for the water to leave, was through the tunnel that they had just made. So it was a really bad plan here, because it floods out the entire Goblin kingdom.
Yeah. It's an interesting way to end it. And we'll talk about this more with the next chapter in just a few moments, but it really seems like they take care of their own problem that they're creating instead of the people of the kingdom rising up.
Yeah, the goblins almost defeat themselves, right? In a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they do seem to kind of be writing their own demise here and not realizing it. That's interesting that McDonald chooses to have them lose the battle in this, or the war really, in this particular way.
Yeah. I suppose that it would be pretty violent otherwise. And this does, it almost, and it's serious because it's, I'm imagining that this flood takes people's lives, not just washes them away. But it does, it leaves a little bit of that up to imagination. And then it also gets to skip some of the details. And it also makes them seem a little bit like buffoons because they caused this problem and wiped themselves out.
And there's even this cleansing imagery too, kind of the water imagery of cleansing the kingdom of this threat and then physically taking them away, not just ending them in their presence, but physically moving them out of the kingdom. And it's as this kind of image is occurring in front of our protagonist here that Curdy has this moment of, oh my gosh, we've got to go back. Grandma's up there. We got to go save Grandma. And Irene kind of has this moment where she's like, are you serious? She's like, that is like, my grandmother is in no danger, is what she says, smiling.
And then just in case you missed the Jesus parallel, she adds, she could probably walk on water.
Yes. That is a great line. And she says, you see, my grandmother knows all about it and isn't frightened. I believe she could walk through that water and it wouldn't wet her a bit. Exactly. And so grandmother is fine. And what's interesting is we actually never see the grandmother again. She's done for the rest of the book, which means that the last time we saw her is really in that dream of Curdy. She really does have this Aslan or divine presence of kind of only being there when she needs to be.
Right.
Again, this wonderful, picture of faith. The frustrating parts of faith, where it sometimes she doesn't always feel fully present, even when she really is. She's not always in the narrative. There's kind of these moments, kind of like in the book of Esther, where it just so happens that this one thing occurs, and that there's some divine sovereignty there, but you don't necessarily see it until after it occurs, right?
Right.
Or you might want something more physical, more tangible. But Irene is able to believe this. But for Curdy, it's harder. He has to trust Irene when Irene says, no, I promise she's fine.
Yeah. And again, applying the lesson from before, he's learned to trust Irene.
Well, then they do, the water is able, they get down eventually to the cellar. They're able to kind of close the hole off and get a lot of the water to die out.
Curdy's able to go get some warmer clothes for Irene.
Yes, exactly, because they're getting chilly. And they go and they take care of some of the horses. And after all of this occurs, obviously the castle's still in disrepair, but this is when the king kind of turns to Curdy and says, I would like you to enter my bodyguard and wait further promotion, right? So there's more to come. And his parents are overwhelmed. Of course, they're sad, but they're really excited and proud of their son. And Curdy says, I can't leave my father and mother. And I love Irene here showing kind of her youth. She's like, oh, that's right, Curdy. I wouldn't if I was you.
Thanks, Irene.
Yeah.
For the backup.
And the king says, I think you're probably right, Curdy. And I'm not going to ask you again, but I shall have a chance of doing something for you sometime. So there's this kind of almost favor being owed to Curdy, even though Curdy says you don't really need to do that.
Because you've already allowed me to serve you. Is what it's a very graceful back and forth.
His mother then says, Curdy's mother says to him, why shouldn't you go with the king? You can't get on very well. We can get on very well without you. Curdy says, but I can't get on very well without you. The king is very kind, but I could not be half the use to him that I am to you. And then he goes on and asks the king for a petticoat. What do you make for his mom, if you recall? What do you make of him saying, I can't get on very well without you to his parents? despite the fact that he's really shown himself to be quite mature and grown up at this point in the story.
Yeah. Part of it is I think that he acknowledges that he has more to learn still. And the reason that he's so advanced for his age is because of his mom and dad. And I think that he wants to stick with them and learn more instead of just immediately going into this service role.
It's so interesting for a fairy tale like this to leave with our hero, because really Curdy is the hero of the book. It's so interesting for him to leave with being like, no, I don't want any more adventures. I'm going to stay with mom and dad. You just don't see that very often.
Yeah.
And that's really where the chapter ends. Many of the people from the castle go off with the miners, and the king tells everyone to listen to Curdy. And that brings us to the last chapter, which is a very short chapter here. And in this, Ludi is going home with the Peterson. She goes home with Curdy and Mr. and Mrs. Peterson. And there is really the only important thing that happens here is there's this interesting moment. Oh, no, there's two. Let's talk about two things. Let's talk about the least important thing first, which is that we do know that some of the goblins do escape. Tell me about this.
They become milder over time in character and indeed become very much like the Scotch brownies. I'm picturing the cartoon characters on cookie packages.
The Keebler elves?
Yeah. Is that what I'm meant to understand?
No, I
here?
think they're
What are
just
Scotch
another
brownies?
I think they're another kind of form of goblin. They're part of kind of the folklore in Scotland of kind of little goblins.
Okay.
We also learn that the Cobb's creatures are taken care of. And we are told that the queen died with her shoe on.
Yeah. Which to me clears up the theory of is the Goblin Queen Irene's mother. It seems like that was a no.
Yes, definitely not her mother. There was a little bit of time where we thought she might be, but
Thought she could be.
maybe we'll find out more about her in the sequel. But I want to go back to the beginning of this chapter, the very first paragraph. I'd like to read it here because it's one last kind of beautiful moment that MacDonald gives us as we think about our faith. All the rest went up the mountain and separated in groups to the homes of the miners. Curdy and his father and mother took Ludi with them, and the whole way a light, of which all but Ludi understood the origin, shone upon their path. But when they looked round, they could see nothing of the silvery globe. This is such a really sad ending for Ludi, that here they go. They're going back to their home. The grandmother is guiding their way with her light, which is this magical, mysterious presence from the castle that we don't understand how it works, but we do understand who it comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Curdy now understands it, and his parents, who have never met the grandmother, understand it. So we should take from this that Curdy has explained it to them, and they've just accepted it based on their faith, right? And yet Ludi, who lives in the castle, who tends to Irene, who has every reason, proximity-wise, to believe in the grandmother, to understand the origin of this, just can't seem to get it. It's kind of a question of how much of this is on Ludi and how much of this is the grandmother. And kind of another way to think about this is, does the grandmother have to reveal herself to be known, or is it something that is it a barrier that Ludi is pulling up? We see times in Scripture where, I think probably most famously in the book of Exodus, where the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart, right, in order to kind of continue this story, to make his glory known. And then there's other times where we can think of people who themselves kind of harden their own heart, right? And so a question here is, for me, is what's occurring with Ludi?
Yeah. I think about the Apostle Paul and just the dramatic thing that happens on the way to Damascus. Mm-hmm. He's struck blind. He has this encounter. He hears an audible voice. And then he goes on to become such a powerful influence and force for the Lord.
Yeah.
And to me, I think, well, yeah, if we had God do that to a few people today, maybe something similar would happen. But instead, I at times feel like I have to explain this thing that sounds crazy, and there's no direct visible evidence right here. You're not, you and I are not actually hearing an audible voice when we feel the Lord is speaking to us. And I'm curious, does Ludi need for the grandmother to be seen? Because I don't think that would actually help, based on some of the stuff the grandmother has said.
Well, she's even said if she saw me, she just wouldn't believe it. She would find other excuses for it.
And that makes me think that it's still on Ludi's side. But also, Ludi's made some other mistakes. I'm curious what it would take for her to believe. And I'm also curious if we will get to see that. Because it's interesting that Ludi's going back with the family. Did she get fired?
No, she's going back because the castle's wet.
Okay.
So it's
She needs
wet
it.
is not. I mean, it's flooded, right?
Yeah.
So all of the people are leaving to go home with different miners. They're going to kind of take care of them.
Okay, and they just happen to go.
And they
home.
happen to get Ludi, right? And I'm sure Curry's like, how did this work out? Like,
Yeah.
or maybe really it is kind of his own generosity. Like, hey, let's Ludi's going to really
could
struggle
be.
here. Let's. It probably really is that. If it was me, I'd be like, oh my gosh, can someone else take this woman? but he seems to just offer this generosity to her. But I think you're right. I think this is a choice that Ludi has made, and whatever happens, she just won't believe. She'll tell herself other lies. She's not open to receiving any of the truth that is put forth by the grandmother.
Yeah.
But so interesting that we leave that here. Any final thoughts?
My final thought is that the Scotch brownies, they become like Scotch brownies. These goblins' skulls become softer as well as their hearts, but their feet grow harder.
Interesting.
It almost seems like they're adapting back into the world.
You're right. I think so.
They're being reintegrated into society.
They're coming back into being more and more like humans.
Yeah.
Well, Phil, at the very end, in my version of the book, I have one of those asides from the readers too, which I don't think you have in that paperback copy you've got in front of you.
I do not.
And one of the things I just wanted to mention is there's a little bit. I'll read maybe the last three paragraphs here, the short little paragraphs between the listeners, the readers of the story, and MacDonald. Here's what the children or the readers say. But we want to know more about them. Speaking of Princess and of the Princess and Curdy. Someday, perhaps, I may tell you the further history of both of them. How Curdy came to visit Irene's grandmother and what she did for him, and how the princess and he met again after they were older, and how... But, I don't mean to go any farther at present. Then you're leaving the story unfinished, Mr. Author. Not more unfinished than a story ought to be, I hope. If you ever knew a story finished, all I can say is, I never did. Somehow, stories won't finish. I think I know why, but I won't say that either now. The end.
What a funny kind of bumbling. It almost reminds me of the grandfather in The Princess and the Bride.
Sure.
Just blah, 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 blah,
The Princess and the Bride?
Princess Bride.
There you go.
The Princess Bride. Yes. Every time I read the title of this book, The Princess and the Goblin,
you want
I'm
to call it The
afraid
Princess
of saying
Goblin?
Bride, and then I finally did it right here at the end.
There you go.
Just kind of a bumbling, not saying something that's super clear, alluding to something for next time, but without giving too much away.
Yeah, I first you get this kind of fun, allusion to, there's this other story that I kind of know about. I'm not going to tell you about it right now. But then we get to the second little thing here, kind of, you look at it in comparison to this fun little fairy tale, or allusion to more fairy tales to come, where he says, not more unfinished than a story ought to be. Some stories won't finish, and I think I know why, but I won't say that either. I think there's really two things that I take away from this. here. Two things I think he could mean here, and I don't pretend to know exactly what MacDonald is thinking or writing here. I wonder how much of it is just about people themselves, that our stories are continuing. Like, we are always being more and more sanctified. There's always more faith to grow in, right? And so for Irene and Curdy, the story always, of course, it continues. Even though Curdy's been a hero, even though Irene has been saved and has, pretty much, quote unquote, passed all the faith tests, the whole book, she's always believed in the grandmother. She's always been able to trust in her. There's still more to go. The story's not done, That's true of us, right? It's not like, okay, I am baptized, I'm done. I'm confirmed, or I'm. Different people do different things. I'm born again. All these things, right? It's over. I'm a Christian. I'm done. That's not the way that our stories really work. So I think there's some of that. I also think too is the idea of, you get this at the very end of the last battle, where into eternity, it's just the beginning. There is no ending, right? Eternity is eternity. And so our story with God will never be finished, actually. Even though the story of the Bible, the Gospels, have a finite ending, our time with God is infinite. It goes on forever.
I think a lot about this with happy endings versus sad endings. You can have a happy ending if you just stop at the right spot, but that doesn't match up with real life. Real life just keeps going. And the nice thing about that is that there are more happy things on the way, especially if you do believe in the Lord and you are looking forward to eternity for that reason. But yeah, it's an interesting. It's interesting because I feel like stories do have an end, and that's a really positive thing. But I also understand what the society is saying. It's a mix for me.
Yeah. Well, any final things? We do have an email that I want us to read, but any final things here about the Princess and the Goblin? And we'll still talk a little bit more about it, especially in our next episode as we get into the fantastic imagination, MacDonald's essay that we're going to read and discuss. We'll do a lot of that through the lens of the Princess and the Goblin, just because that's the work that we spent time with. And so there's more discussions to be had there. But any final thoughts?
I'm looking forward to reading the second one. Do you think we'll do it as part of this show? Or
I hope so. No, okay. I think so. I think maybe, obviously we'll do The Hobbit next.
Yeah.
Who knows what we'll do after that. Maybe it's Curdy. Maybe there's other, you and I both have that list of books to do, and I haven't decided, you haven't decided. So, but I do want to come back to MacDonald.
I just wanted to know, it's not ruled out.
No.
It's not like we're not coming back to it.
No, okay. It's absolutely an option. I'm also very intrigued to potentially read some of his other shorter fairy stories. I'm like, is there maybe we go on for 2 or 3 episodes like we're about to do with Smith of Wootton Major by Tolkien, and come back and do something like The Light Princess or something like that, because that's not like a full season worth of a book, because I think it's only like 100 pages. But yeah, I'm still going to go read it this summer anyways, regardless of us.
I think that subconsciously that is why I want to go. I want to go read it.
Well, let me ask you this just real quick then before we do this email. Have you read The Hobbit at all recently?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, I'm not doing that again. Yeah, anything on that list is fair game. I'm reading it as soon as I can. I'm not going to be that the person who doesn't know anymore.
Well, why don't you go ahead and read this email that we got from Caleb Cook. It is simply entitled George MacDonald.
All right, let's take a look. Caleb says, "Hello, Phil and Daniel."
That's right.
And part of the reason we're reading this is got the order right.
Oh, okay.
You know who Clark and Lewis are? I am a long-time listener, having been following your journey through all the Narnia and now as you foray into the worlds of MacDonald. With the combination of these two authors, I want you to know that you are essentially traversing the landscape of my childhood imagination. These were the stories that my father read me on his knee before I was old enough even to understand everything. These were the stories for which I learned to read in order that I could visit them on my own. These are the stories that I passed on to my children, and these are the stories I still carry within. I love listening to y'all discover them and all the things you have been discussing. After the Curdy books, which is how my father and Jack referred to this duology, I hope that you delve into his other fairy tales. The Lost Princess contains one of the most beautiful poetic opening descriptions, as well as possibly the longest Victorian run-on sentence, filled with whimsy. I love introducing MacDonald novices to those opening paragraphs as a taste of his mastery of visual prose. The story of Day Boy and Night Girl, although not about Disney Channel superheroes, delves deeply into fear, bravery, and the divine work of suffering. It might be my favorite. Thank you for bringing us along on your journey, Caleb Cook.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Caleb.
Yeah, Caleb, that was so fun to hear, and it makes me even more excited to read more of George MacDonald's work.
Mention to me, Phil, or just say it again. Is it Day Boy and Night Girl? What's the name of it again? I want to make sure I say that correctly. Day Boy and Night Girl. I have read. I told you I've been working through this book, Informing the Inklings, which is a collection of essays on George MacDonald, and I've also just been trying to read more about him as we go through. It hasn't come as much into the actual, not like in Narnia, I'd pull from books all the time that I was reading, just because there aren't as many sources. Like, there are not as many like kind of popular works. There's a lot more academic-y stuff, but not kind of things you can just kind of pick off a bookstore bookshelf and read about. But one of the stories is I've read these, I've come across, is Day Boy and Night Girl. And it has risen to near the top of my list of things I'm going to read this year. I actually picked up a collection of, it's just called like George MacDonald's Fairy Tales. It's a Penguin classic book, and it has that in it. And so I think, did I order you one? We can use some of the podcast money to get you some too.
That would be nice. I'm enjoying my Tolkien 4-pack that you.
Oh, I know, wasn't that so fun? Yeah, we'll talk about that when we cover Smith of Wooten Major. Because that thing is fun. I've got it on my bookshelf right there. I'm going to take it actually to campus and keep it there. But it's looking nice while it's here.
I reorganized my shelf, and I now have a row of my favorite books, a row of books I also want to keep, and then I have a row of books that are on deck that I want to read.
Yeah. And
I moved the Tolkien books immediately onto that shelf because I'm hoping to start those maybe after tonight.
I want to come back to this other. I have a comment about that, but I want to end with Caleb's email here before I say anything else about that and get us off topic again. But I think one of the things that Caleb just kind of casually touches on here is kind of traversing the landscape of his childhood imagination is how really spectacular it has been for you and I to follow along backwards here. I think that Princess and the Goblin might not have affected me and moved me as much. And even, I don't know that I would have caught on to all that MacDonald was up to. Some of the big things like, hey, this is what a princess is, and this is what a prince is, I think anybody can get, right? But some of those other things, I think, had I read it before reading Annie Lewis, I just don't think I would have been as primed to really get as much out of it. And yet here I am reading it after we've spent a billion years reading Lewis, and I feel as though it's just so much richer because of that. I just am curious too. Have you enjoyed reading this book?
I have, very much. I was surprised at how accessible it felt. It was easier for me to read than I thought it would be. I think that a story is really good if you're kind of longing to visit this world again, and I am. I want to go back. I'm excited for the next one. Sometimes when I read a book, I'm so glad to be done. It's an effort to push through. And I was also very impressed with how vivid everything felt. It was very easy to imagine what things looked like and what the characters were feeling, but without the same kind of prose and mastery of the language that I feel like Lewis brought to it. So Lewis really had a different style, but I still feel like the storytelling was masterfully done with George MacDonald's approach.
Yeah, that's well said. Well, Caleb, thanks so much for this email. It's been great to hear from listeners who also are MacDonald fans, because you and I are brand new MacDonald fans. I mean, this is really the only thing I've read by him besides a couple of small things. I tried to read Fantasties a few years ago, didn't get through it. And I guess you know a lot more than I do, but...
So my dad read Wee Sir Gibbie of the Highlands.
But that was it, right?
I think that was... There may have been a second book, but I was pretty young, so I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like you and I are both we're making leaps and bounds, but we're still not
Mhm.
necessarily to the place where we can enjoy something like Fantasties. And I feel like I've improved as a reader just because of this show. We have to read the chapters twice. We
Mhm.
have to write summaries. We have to be able to talk about
Yeah.
what happens in them. And we've also just matured. We've been doing this for going on 7 years at this
Yeah, we
point.
like to think we're a little bit better readers than we were,
Right.
seven,
And
8 years
we're
ago.
also just older. There's, life stuff that makes it a little bit easier to
We have
read.
bigger dictionaries now, so it's easier to wade through some of these words.
Right. We
And
can just tap and look
that's
stuff
right.
up. But I feel like we are getting closer to being able to enjoy something like Fantasties.
Yeah, Lilith is on. Fantasties he writes at the beginning of his career, and then these books kind of bookend his career. Fantasties at the beginning, Lilith at the end, and I am very excited to pick up and read Lilith. I'm gonna try. I don't know if I get to it this year, but at least in the next, but by summer of 2026, it's kind of on my list of books that I've got lined up for the next 18 months or so.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a great place for us to stop. Since you read the email, I'll go ahead and do our end credits here. And again, we're going to be talking next episode about the fantastic imagination, which is not super hard to find PDF versions of that online. So if you want to go ahead and read it before we cover it, if you just search on the internet, Jordan McDougall, go Bing this thing, you'll find it.
Go to MSN.com and then type in Bing and then go to the search bar, Google.
And AskJeeves.com. AskJeeves.com. Fantastic Imagination. You'll find it there by George MacDonald. Episodes made possible by our patrons over at Patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode every single month, along with other rewards. Special thanks goes to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, Ryan Smith, Andrew Trophy, Becca Brown, Christiana Line, and Ian Wooten for supporting us all at our top tiers. If you have any listener feedback, you can always email us at hello@lamppostlistener.com or call us and leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. We always appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts because this helps other listeners find the show and join together in our readings. Thank you again coming along for this journey, and we will be back next time with the fantastic imagination.
See you in a couple weeks.